There is a silence more complete than the absence of sound. It is the stillness that falls upon the mind when truth has been glimpsed, not as a doctrine, but as a wound. You feel it not in the ears, but in the marrow, in the space between one breath and the next, when the soul turns inward and finds no sky, only reflection. In this moment, the soul does not cry out. It recoils, like a hand burned on the iron of reality. Every life begins in blindness. The infant knows no difference between self and world, pain and promise. It learns through hunger that it is separate, and from that moment it suffers. The will awakens not as a noble force, but as a restless hunger, gnawing at the edges of consciousness. The first scream is not of joy, but of protest, and this protest never ends. It is merely refined, dressed in the garments of desire and ambition, but at its core it is the same. The will saying, I want against a world that does not answer. We are taught to praise life, but seldom to observe it, to live it noisily, but never to sit quietly in its shadow. The world is loud with promises, success, love, purpose, transcendence. But every promise is carved from illusion. Scratch the surface of joy, and you will find anticipation. And beneath anticipation, fear. What we call happiness is but a brief cessation of longing, a temporary truce between the will and the void it fears. To see clearly is not to be uplifted, it is to be undone. For clarity reveals the prison in which consciousness rides. The body, the mind, the endless march of time, all are bars of a cage we decorate with meaning. Yet the soul, if it listens, can still hear the echo of that first cry, the raw, unfiltered, knowing that to exist is to suffer, and to suffer is to be. Civilization is but a monument to the will's defiance of this truth. Cities rise not to shelter the spirit, but to distract it. Culture exists not to express truth, but to veil it in beauty. Religion whispers of eternal reward, not because the soul is divine, but because it is desperate. And technology, our most recent idol, seduces us with the promise that suffering is obsolete, just one upgrade away from extinction. Yet, pain remains. Always, the void does not blink. We worship progress, but progress is a treadmill. One desire supplants another. One illusion fades, another takes its place. What we call growth is the stretching of chains, not their removal. Freedom is the illusion of movement in a cage whose bars we have forgotten to see. To pursue desire is to feed the fire that burns us. And yet we pursue, not because we believe, but because we cannot help ourselves. The will is a tyrant that rules even in silence. Even love, that sacred lie, is but the will's most seductive snare. We do not fall into it, we are driven, pulled by the illusion that another can complete what is fundamentally empty. But no soul can fill another's abyss. At best, two voids briefly overlap, mistaking each other's darkness for light. At worst, we use love to mask possession, control, fear. The child clings to the parent. The lover clings to the beloved, not out of joy, but out of dread. Dread of solitude, dread of looking into the mirror alone. And so we flee inward, not into truth, but into narrative. We tell ourselves stories of purpose, of redemption, of growth. We become characters in our own myths, and the world becomes a stage upon which we pretend. But even the best performance cannot change the nature of the stage. It is built on impermanence, crowned with death. The play ends not with applause, but with silence. And the audience, too, will be dust. The wise do not seek to escape this. They do not dress suffering in golden robes. They sit with it. They feel its cold fingers around the ribs. They watch as it drains the color from dreams, and they do not protest. They know that protest is the last illusion, the belief that we are owed more than nothing, that existence is a gift rather than a sentence, that the light has meaning because it flickers. But meaning is the greatest fiction. It is the drug the ego cannot resist. Strip it away, and the world appears not malevolent but indifferent. The stars do not care. The earth spins whether we laugh or weep. The sun rises on genocide and garden alike. The universe is not hostile, it is empty. And from that emptiness we craft meaning like a beggar, sculpting gods out of ash. We name things not to understand them, but to soften their edges. We speak not to reveal, but to forget. And yet, in this very awareness, There is a strange kind of peace, not the peace of joy, but the peace of surrender. The quiet acceptance that suffering is not a punishment, but a condition, that nothing is owed, and therefore nothing is lost. That to exist is to ache, and to ache is to know one is alive. We mistake numbness for healing, and pleasure for peace. But true peace begins where desire ends, in the stillness after despair, where the will no longer cries out. The soul, once broken, sees with different eyes. It no longer seeks to conquer, but to comprehend. It no longer demands, but observes. The mirror remains, and in it one sees not the self, but the absence of self, a flickering awareness floating in a body doomed to fade. And in that absence, a strange lucidity, the clarity of knowing that the struggle was never to win, but to see, not to arrive, but to awaken. This is the beginning of descent, not into darkness, but into truth, not into madness, but into lucidity. The veil is lifting, the dream dissolves, and what remains is not despair, but understanding cold, vast, and strangely sacred. Suffering is the undercurrent of all consciousness. It does not appear as anomaly, but as essence. Even in moments we call joy, it hides beneath quiet, patient, like the shadow that never leaves the body. Pleasure is merely the brief lifting of pressure, a pause in the vice of becoming, but the hand always tightens again, for the will never sleeps. It dreams with eyes open, and the dream is hunger. We suffer, not because life is unjust, but because it is blind. The world is not cruel, for cruelty implies intention. It is indifferent, mechanistic, cold. The rain falls on the innocent and the damned alike, and time does not slow for the morning. Death visits not in moral sequence, but in silence and randomness, as if even it cannot be bothered to discern meaning from the chaos. What we call tragedy is simply the truth made visible. When a child dies, or love collapses, or the mind unravels into madness, we glimpse what always was, that safety is fiction, that permanence is delusion. The structures we build, homes, nations, identities, are scaffolds of straw set against a storm that never ceases. And yet we are told to believe in progress, in justice, in love. But belief is the veil the will wraps around terror. Illusion is not merely deception, it is refuge. Without it, the raw face of existence would break most minds. And so we dream with open eyes. We call suffering growth and speak of resilience. Not because it saves us, but because it numbs us. Language is our first opiate. It turns the unbearable into poetry, the abyss into metaphor. But behind every word lies a silence that does not forgive. The will feeds on these illusions. It shapes the ego to serve its hunger. I want, says the child, and the echo follows through life. I want love. I want success. I want to be remembered. But all wanting is a wound that deepens with each desire fulfilled, for nothing quenches. Fulfillment is a mirage that vanishes upon arrival. And so we chase again, not because we are hopeful, but because we are slaves. Slavery to the will is not visible. It wears the face of freedom, the freedom to choose, to move, to become. But to become is always to become discontent. One identity replaces another. One goal dissolves into the next. The self mutates endlessly. A snake eating its own tail, each rebirth celebrated, each death ignored. But beneath each version of self lies the same emptiness, the terror of being. Detachment is not renunciation, it is awakening. To detach is not to flee, but to see without reaching. To witness the suffering of the world and not be consumed. To love without possession. To grieve without protest. To exist without demand. The detached soul does not resist pain, but lets it pass through, like wind through a hollow reed. For what is there to protect, when the self is only a shadow? But this detachment is not passive. It is the fiercest clarity. It is not apathy, but understanding. To see the child suffer and still know that the universe does not care. To see beauty and know that it will die. To hold joy in one's hands and feel its weightlessness. Nothing lasts, not because it is stolen, but because it was never held. All that appears is already on its way to disappearing. The ego mourns this. It cannot accept impermanence, for it is built on the illusion of continuity. It says, I am, and believes in the threat of selfhood. but the thread is memory stitched together by narrative. There is no self, only the movement of thought, the trembling of will, the flicker of perception pretending to be a person. Identity is the dream the void has while pretending to be awake. What then remains? If suffering is constant, if the self is illusion, if desire is slavery, what is left when all veils are torn away? The answer is not comfort, but stillness. The stillness of a soul no longer fighting its nature. It does not rejoice, for there is no triumph. It does not despair, for despair is the resistance to what is. It simply is like a stone at the bottom of a river, unmoved by the current. Even time loses its teeth in this silence. It no longer rushes. The days pass without urgency. The seasons turn, and the soul watches not with hope, but with recognition. Everything returns. The suffering of one generation is the suffering of all. The pain we feel has been felt by millions before, and will be felt again, endlessly. Individual suffering is but a wave in an ocean that has never been still. Yet even in this vast sea of sorrow, there is beauty not in spite of pain, but through it. The way light touches a dying leaf. The way an old man holds the hand of his dead wife. These moments do not redeem suffering. They reveal it. And in that revelation, there is something sacred, not divine, but pure, unfiltered. When we stop seeking meaning, we see more clearly. When we stop running, the world stops fleeing. Modernity cannot tolerate this stillness. It demands movement, distraction, noise. It offers endless escape, screens, slogans, pills, gods. The soul is never allowed to rest in itself. It must produce, consume, believe, become, and so it forgets how to simply be. The ancient solitude is lost, and with it, the capacity to see suffering not as flaw, but as essence. But solitude can return, not through withdrawal, but through surrender. To surrender is not to give up, but to stop pretending. It is to stand naked before the mirror of existence and see the face beneath all masks, tired, wounded, endlessly reaching, and then to stop reaching. Not because one is whole, but because one accepts the hollow. This is not nihilism, it is clarity. The nihilist rejects value. The awakened see that all value is projection. That truth is not found in belief, but in the cessation of belief. That peace comes not through attainment, but through the end of seeking. The fire burns out, not because it is extinguished, but because the fuel is gone. The will ceases when it is no longer fed. And then, only then, does silence become real. Not the silence of isolation, but of liberation. No more needing, no more grasping. The soul sits quietly in the wreckage of dreams and does not rebuild. It watches the stars without naming them. It weeps without story. It breathes without purpose. And in that purposelessness, it is finally free. There comes a point when the soul ceases to ask, why? Not from wisdom, but from exhaustion. The questioning collapses under its own weight, like a bridge rotted from within. Meaning, once pursued like prey, now floats as ash in the wind. It is not that the answers are absent, it is that the questions themselves dissolve, revealed to be the cries of a child lost in a dream. Even the strongest begin as seekers. They search for order in suffering, for some divine arithmetic to justify the pain. They climb the ladders of faith, ideology, romance, hoping at the summit they might find a sanctuary untouched by decay. But every ladder leads not to heaven, but to another floor of the same crumbling edifice, and the higher one climbs, the harder the fall, back into the eternal sameness of longing. There is no cure for this, only the dim recognition that the wound is congenital. Consciousness itself is the laceration, the self-awareness that renders us spectators of our own decay. The animal feels pain, but does not wonder why it suffers. It does not stare into the night and question the silence. But we do, and that is our burden. The gift we did not ask for, the light that burns the eyes. The poets speak of beauty as salvation, but beauty is a cruel muse. It appears not to heal, but to haunt. The face of the beloved, the curve of a tree against twilight, the sound of music that stirs the chest. These do not relieve suffering, they refine it. They sharpen longing into a blade that cuts more deeply. For in beauty, we glimpse what the world could be, but is not. And this contrast wounds. And yet we return to it, again and again as moths to flame. Because even suffering becomes sacred when it is known fully, when we do not turn away, when we do not dress it in myth, but sit within it, as one sits within a temple, silent, alert, grieving. There, the pain ceases to be a problem and becomes a presence. Something ancient, something vast. It is no longer mine, it is the world's, and I am merely its echo. Detachment deepens here, not as distance, but as intimacy, without possession. I do not hold the world, but I do not flee it either. I witness it as one watches the sea, knowing it will never speak my name, yet unable to look away. This gaze is the last form of love. The love that asks for nothing, takes nothing, and yet remains. The love of what is, even in its ruin. The gods we made no longer suffice. Their promises were thin. They speak in platitudes, while the earth burns and the mind fractures. Once we asked them for justice, for purpose, for immortality. Now we ask only for silence. And even that they cannot grant. They are too noisy with hope, too enamored with virtue. They cannot sit in the void and not tremble. But the void does not tremble. It waits. Not with patience, for it has no will. It waits the way stone waits. Unchanging, untouched by the storms we call tragedy. To enter it is not to be swallowed, but to dissolve into something vaster. The self does not die in the void. It is revealed to have never been. And what remains is not nothingness, but a form of awareness, no longer chained to becoming. Grief is the gate to this realm. Not the grief of a single loss, but the grief of recognizing that all is loss. That every embrace is temporary. That every love story is a slow farewell. That memory is not a treasure, but a tomb. When this is seen not as idea, but as bone-deep reality, then grief ceases to be emotional and becomes elemental. It saturates the air one breathes, the water one drinks. It becomes the world. And strangely, within this universal grief, one begins to see clearly, as though the tears have washed away the last distortions. One walks through life not lighter, but more rooted. The smile is rarer, but when it comes, it is pure. The words are fewer, but when they arrive, they are true. Nothing is fixed, yet nothing is false. The performance ends, and what remains is simply the actor, naked, tired, human. Modern man fears silence more than death. He fills every space with noise, every moment with motion. He does not know how to be still, for stillness reveals the truth he has buried beneath achievement and distraction, that his life, though loud, is empty. That his successes are scaffolds built on sand. That beneath the luxury, he is afraid, not of failure, but of the void he has denied. To live in awareness of this void is to walk a path without destination. One does not arrive, one sheds. Each step removes another illusion. The belief in fairness, the myth of self-control, the hope of lasting joy. And what is left is not despair, but release. Like laying down a burden one has carried since birth, without knowing why. The back straightens, the breath deepens. There is no elation, only relief. Even death loses its teeth here. It is no longer the feared end, but the inevitable breath that follows all others. We do not die tragically, we return to the silence from which we briefly emerged. The candle does not mourn the extinguishing flame. It was meant to burn, and then to darken. Only the ego, that trembling architect of permanence, calls this a tragedy. But the soul, when quieted, understands. There is no need for legacy, no need for remembrance. To be forgotten is not failure, it is nature. The wave crashes, the shore is unchanged. What matters is not that we were seen, but that we saw, that we felt deeply, even if it hurt, that we gazed into the abyss and did not blink, that we tasted the rawness of being, even if we could not hold it. And so we walk, not with hope, but with awareness, not seeking answers, but relinquishing questions. The world remains what it is, cruel, beautiful, indifferent. And we remain what we are, fleeting awareness within decaying flesh. But within this brief flicker, there is the possibility of clarity, not salvation, not meaning, just clarity. And sometimes that is enough. There is a certain point in the soul's erosion where even desire itself becomes transparent. It no longer shouts, no longer seduces, it whispers in corners, a tired ghost haunting a house it no longer believes it owns. You see it there, flickering behind ambitions, behind love, behind even the will to survive. What was once urgent now appears absurd. To strive, to reach, to grasp these gestures resemble a hand clenching water. In this quiet disillusionment, the masks begin to fall. The lover becomes a reflection of one's longing, not a savior. The child, once a symbol of future hope, is seen as another vessel of inherited suffering. Work no longer offers pride, only distraction. And the self, the cherished nucleus of all effort, is revealed as a thought, repeating itself endlessly. A thought that fears silence, and calls that fear identity. Even the body becomes foreign. It aches not with age alone, but with awareness. Every breath is a reminder of finitude, every heartbeat a step closer to cessation. The flesh, once a vehicle for pleasure, now reveals its fragility, how easily it breaks, how silently it decays. The mirror becomes a cruel oracle, not because it lies, but because it cannot. Those who still believe speak of purpose, as if life were a narrative with climax and resolution. But purpose is a story whispered into the void to keep it from echoing back our own questions. There is no final scene, no orchestrated closure, only an unraveling. The thread doesn't end, it frays. And what we are left with is not triumph, but unraveling without reason. And yet, strangely, this unraveling is not terrifying, it is liberating. To be stripped of illusions is not to be left bare, but to be left real. The soul, no longer covered in the garments of hope, feels the cold, and through that cold, the sharpness of truth. That all this pageantry of becoming was never meant to satisfy. It was only meant to continue. We call this suffering. But suffering is not the enemy. Suffering is the teacher, the only one that never lies. Joy flatters, belief comforts, but suffering reveals. It pulls the curtain away. It shows the strings behind the puppet, the cracks in the foundation, the abyss beneath the floor. It does not ask if we are ready. It simply speaks, and we are changed. Some resist. They drown themselves in excess, in noise, in borrowed philosophies that promise return, healing, transcendence. But the soul knows. It remembers the silence. It remembers the stillness beneath the storm, and eventually it returns. Not because it has found peace, but because it can no longer bear to lie. The return is not dramatic. It happens in moments, waking in the night with no name in mind, watching dust fall through a beam of light, hearing the cry of a stranger, and not knowing why one weeps. These moments are sacred, not because they save, but because they reveal what needs no saving. This is the clarity that does not lift the burden, but changes its shape. One still feels pain, still wakes to dread, still fears loss, but these no longer define the self. They are seen as weather. They pass through. And the soul, now a quiet observer, no longer tries to stop the rain. It sits, drenched, unmoving. Even memory changes. What once brought joy or regret now feels distant, like stories told about someone else. The past loses its weight, not because it is healed, but because it is hollow. It cannot touch the present, cannot alter what simply is. The soul no longer defends its history, it lets it rot in peace. And in this letting go, a strange compassion arises, not for others, but for all. For the animal, the criminal, the fool, the forgotten. You see them, and you see yourself. Not in shared virtue, but in shared agony. The futility of trying, the absurdity of pretending, the universal ache to mean something when nothing holds. From this compassion grows a gentleness, not born of love, but of resignation. One does not need to forgive, one simply stops judging. The soul no longer divides the world into right and wrong, light and dark. It sees only movement, the blind walking the blind, each trying to make sense of a path that leads nowhere. And nowhere is sacred, because nowhere cannot disappoint. It has no gates, no gods, no punishments. It is not empty, it is untouched. The final illusion is that we are meant to arrive. But the wise do not arrive. They dissolve. They vanish into the very thing they feared. A world without answers, without direction, without consolation. And in vanishing, they become vast. They are no longer a point of desire, but a field of awareness. Watching the sky, the leaves, the faces pass and saying nothing. Because what is there to say when all has been seen? Not in detail, but in essence. That we were born not to triumph, but to witness. That the soul does not travel, it waits. It does not conquer, it yields. It does not shine, it reflects. And so it ends, not in closure, but in stillness. Not with a flame, but with a slow dimming. A return to what was always beneath the silent recognition that to suffer is to exist, and to exist without illusion is the rarest form of peace. There is a final threshold not marked by pain or revelation, but by quiet. It comes when the soul, having exhausted every hunger, every hope, sits without seeking, not as choice, but as inevitability. The hands no longer reach, the eyes no longer search, the breath, unhurried, simply moves in and out of the body, like a tide indifferent to the shore. All stories have fallen away. The myth of self, with its victories and wounds, stands exposed as narrative strings of memory stitched together by fear. Even time loses its grip. Past and future dissolve into the slow pulse of now, where nothing is demanded and nothing promised. The self becomes mist, and even that mist fades. To arrive here is not to conquer, but to vanish. The noise of becoming is gone. What remains is the hum beneath all existence, the soundless murmur of being, of presence, without possession. One does not own this moment. One does not name it. It is not joy. It is not despair. It is the cessation of distinction, the end of division, the undoing of form. Even suffering, that most loyal companion, quiets, not because it is gone, but because it is no longer resisted. It ceases to define. It becomes atmosphere, not affliction. The ache in the chest, the weight in the limbs, the hollow behind the eyes, these no longer demand explanation. They are simply there, like the wind. One no longer asks to be free of them. One breathes through them, as one breathes through all things. What use is speech now? Words fall short, not because they are false, but because truth no longer requires them. The soul no longer seeks to be understood. It is enough to be, to exist without justification, without apology, without narrative. There is no audience, no judgment. The curtain has fallen, the stage is empty, and in the silence, something vast remains. Some call this emptiness, others peace, but names do not matter. The experience is beyond naming. It is not a place, not a state, not a reward. It is simply the absence of striving, the absence of self, a space where the will no longer coils inward, no longer pulses with desire. It lies still, and in that stillness there is a strange, almost imperceptible warmth, not pleasure, but release. To dwell here is not to float above the world, but to be beneath it, like roots beneath the soil, unseen, unmoved, nourishing in silence. One watches the lives above, so full of motion, of meaning, and does not envy them. One weeps, sometimes, but the weeping is pure. It carries no protest, only recognition. Recognition that all of this, all effort, all longing, all creation arises from the same source, the will to be. And when that will is seen for what it is, blind, endless, tireless, it loses its grip. Not because it is defeated, but because it is understood. And what is understood cannot possess. In this place, beyond possession, nothing belongs, yet everything is touched. One does not own beauty, but one sees it. In a child's laughter, in the shadow of a tree, in the stillness of night. These moments pierce not because they fulfill, but because they ask nothing. They pass like birds across a winter sky, leaving no mark. Death, too, changes its face. It is no longer feared. It is no longer waited for. It simply is. The final form of detachment, the last release, not from life, but from the illusion that life must be more than it is. To die becomes as natural as to breathe, no triumph, no tragedy, a return, not a fall. The soul that sees this no longer clings to legacy. It does not ask to be remembered. It does not build monuments. It leaves no last words. Its silence is its final truth. And in that silence, there is something eternal, not in duration, but in depth. A moment stretched beyond time, a presence unshaken by wind or decay. This is not transcendence, it is surrender, not a rising, but a sinking into what has always been. The end of the path is not light, it is not darkness, it is stillness, the kind that holds all motion within it, the kind that does not move, because it does not need. And so the monologue ends not in revelation, but in fading, like a candle allowed to burn out, No wind, no hand, just the slow dimming of flame until only the wick remains, and then not even that. What remains cannot be spoken, it cannot be taught. It can only be seen by eyes no longer needing to see, by a self no longer needing to be. The void, once feared, becomes home. Not a place of emptiness, but of fullness unclaimed. And the soul, at last, becomes what it always was. A mirror turned to the sky, reflecting nothing, holding everything, desiring nothing, touched by all.